knowledge about how to make a person happy. First, you take away their donkey. Then, you give it back. In many works of literature and lore critical to the newfound joy of finding something that's been lost is a shift in the perspective about what was previously taken for granted, or what was simply invisible in plain sight. Nothing alters appreciation for circumstances more effectively than a view from another vantage point. Today's lessons invite God's people to step back and survey their circumstances through a new lens. Isaiah exhorting the Israelites to patience and faith in the Lord who led them into exile, urging those weary wanderers yearning for the promised land to believe in God's capacity to deliver them. Isaiah reminds God's people that God is huge and we are tiny. Rather than lose perspective, reframe it. Have you not heard, Isaiah cries, have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. Those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall run and not be weary. And the psalmist points to the Lord who rebuilds Jerusalem, gathers the exiles of Israel, heals the brokenhearted, binds up their wounds, counts the number of stars, calls each star by name. The Lord, mighty in power, there is no limit to his wisdom. The Lord lifts up the lowly, provides food for flocks and herds, is not impressed with the strength of a horse, has no pleasure in the strength of a man, but the Lord has pleasure in those who fear him, in those who wait for his gracious favor. God gave us the capacity to keep his power in perspective relative to our tiny position. Whereas God extends infinitely, our finite limitations are ever present. Awareness of that relationship remains a central tenet of the Christian faith and life. Jesus' entire earthly ministry kept God's presence and power in perspective. Consider today's story from Mark's Gospel. Jesus has been traveling around Capernaum, fulfilling his mission, proclaiming God's message, healing the sick, casting out demons. From the synagogue, he heads home with his disciples, ostensibly for rest and sustenance himself, and arriving at Peter and Andrew's house, Jesus makes time for one more healing. Peter's mother-in-law has fallen ill. She is so sick she cannot get out of bed to greet her honored guest. And Jesus delays his own rest to heal her. And the transformation is immediate. The mother-in-law, previously bedridden, becomes the hostess, welcoming and serving her guest. And word has spread about Jesus' recent healing miracles. Crowds seeking healing gather at the door of that house, and he heals them and silences many demons. Now, with places to go to proclaim good news, the attention of his miraculous healings has the potential to slow him down. This is why Mark's gospel refers over and over to how Jesus encourages those he heals to tell no one. Don't talk about it yet. There's too much work to do. Less attention facilitates faster transition from place to place. So Jesus forbids the demons who identify him as the Messiah. He silences them, forbids them to speak. And the next morning, having risen early, Jesus finds a quiet place to pray, and before long, once again, the clamor resumes. Finding Jesus, his disciples report, "Everyone is looking for you. You're in demand." And still no celebrity status impedes Jesus' progress for God. Jesus proceeds with singularity of purpose, sharing the message, let's go to neighboring towns, proclaim God's love, heal in God's name. And so he participates with God in guiding God's people to embrace eternal connection. Perpetuating this perspective of interconnectedness remains Jesus' primary project. Demons, on the other hand, tempt God's people to sin, to separation from God's love. Silencing those demons thwarts their mission to incite fear with pain and suffering and death. Proclaiming God's love, healing God's people, Jesus' perfect love incarnate ejects fear. Demons prey on human fear. What first emerges for you when you consider fear? What are you afraid of? Here are some common fears. Fear of failing, fear of making mistakes, fear of being found out, fear of having imperfections exposed, fear of public speaking, fear of taking risks, fear of encountering the unknown, fear of change, of being misunderstood, of being held responsible, of being legally liable, fear of being taken down for something said by or about oneself, true or false, in or out of context, fear of scarcity, fear of many forms of loss. Loss of income, loss of employment, loss of livelihood, loss of control, loss of a loved one, loss of freedom. Fear of chaos, fear of the outsider, fear of the stranger, the different, the terrible, the terrifying and horrific, fear of wild animals, of poisonous snakes, fear of fish with teeth, spiders, stinging insects, fear of the dentist. I heard today even fear of the hairdresser. Fear of suffering, fear of pain. All these fears connect to one of the greatest fears often left unspoken, fear of dying. Many fears connect to our primal fear of death. Brain scientists and psychologists describe the phenomenon of experiencing reptilian brain, when our brains receive signals that suggest, even often subconsciously, this might kill me. Rational or not, human beings have a primal response to such stimuli. And stimuli like that are different for every single human being. The survival instinct, fight or flight response, is hardwired into every human being. To fear is to be human. Fear can paralyze. Fear can perpetuate pernicious behavior. Fear buried or denied holds more insidious control than fear acknowledged and owned. And therein lies the power in FDR's famous inaugural wisdom. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Demons drive to feed fear. Fear transforms responses into reactions. Demons delight to foment fear. Demons tempt God's people away from God and celebrate corruption. Fear distracts God's people from the number one priority, God. Whenever we allow fear to come before focus on God, fear itself becomes an idol. Jesus' way of making no time for fear presents a model and a teaching example. Worldly fears have a way of displacing a healthy and appropriate fear of the Lord. Jesus keeps God ever in focus. Today's lessons invite God's people to put God first in all things, including what we fear. What would it mean to reorient our fears? What would it mean to prioritize fear of God? What if what was feared most were failing in relationship with God? How would it look to strive to please God over anyone else? What if fearing God first means relinquishing and releasing subordinate fears? What if every other fear is actually an impediment to glorifying God? If fear of God means remembering that God sees everything, might fear of being exposed in front of peers pale in comparison to fear of exposure before God? Before God, we are still as naked and exposed as Adam and Eve were in the garden. Maybe fear of death has as much to do with that inevitable reckoning that human beings have been avoiding since the fateful moment in the garden after that first couple consumed the forbidden fruit. We all contend with such fear. No one is exempt. When we step back and consider the human experience, so much more connects us than what separates us. We are all connected by something much bigger, which situates us all on the inner rim of something cosmically vast and infinitely enormous. We're like specks in a magnificent painting whose borders extend beyond our vision's capacity to comprehend. Sometimes what is most needed is simply a shift in perspective. As Lent approaches, and it's coming soon, Ash Wednesday is just a little more than a week away, consider what and how personal fears stack up. It may be that improved awareness of our fears bolsters courage to conquer them. Lent can be a time of preparation, of preparing to step out in courage and hope. In the project of coming to trust, respect, honor, and prioritize God, it's more than okay to ask God for help and for healing from our all-consuming fear. That's the baptismal project, after all, to recognize that everything we do with God's help. Great power lies in relinquishing worldly fears to God and focusing on pleasing God. As we prayed at the opening of our service in today's collect, being set free from the bondage of sin means releasing earthly burdens and fears and courageously embracing the weight of Christ's yoke. Put God first and remember, as the psalmist urges, that God does not give up on us. Wait for the Lord, who surely waits for us.